Welcome to India Interacts. In human history, each war has led to efforts to reorder the way we live our lives to make enduring peace. In 20th century, First World War led to setting up of League of Nations. Second World War led to creation of United Nations. But since the end of Cold War, it seems for last 21 years, we have been still discoursing all kinds of shifts that are occurring in international relations. We now talk of shifts from traditional to non-traditional security, from military to economics, from American century to Asian century, but the discourse continues. We are discussing today India and the emerging new world order, responsibilities and challenges. We have an eminent panel for discussion today. The first I wish to introduce is Honorable Shri Kishore Singh. He's been educated in Banaras Hindu University and Oxford. He's been a teacher, journalist, member of parliament, but most important for today's discussion, he was Minister of State in External Affairs during early 1990s when both Indian politics and foreign policy were being redefined. The next on the panel is Nirmala Sitaraman. She also has been formerly student of Jawaharlal Nehru University, a free thinker, and later, of course, she was with BBC World Service Tamil, with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and currently she is the spokesperson for Bharatiya Janata Party. Welcome to the show. Next on the panel is Professor A.K. Ramakrishnan, currently Professor for West Asian Studies in Jawaharlal Nehru University, but formerly Professor for West Asian Studies in Jamia Millia Islamia and in Mahatma Gandhi University, Kottayam. Welcome to the show. Let us begin by discussing today what is the big change that we see around the world happening, and are we in grip of situation, are we in understanding of what is happening around us in the world. And several issues that come to mind particularly revolve around this whole discourse about rising powers and emerging economies, which is where India is located, and how are they participating in new issues now that are emerging, issues of climate change, issues of countering terrorism, issues of nuclear weapon free world, and of course issues like energy security. Now, I will request former foreign minister to begin by telling us how does he see the big picture shifting, and are we in grip of understanding what is happening, and how can India participate in that change?
Thank you. The first thing which comes to my mind in this context is that there is no victor. The Cold War has ended, but there is no victor in that sense that although Russia has, the former Soviet Union has disintegrated, but Russia is a big power. It counts in the world affairs. It has mighty military power, and it can destroy the world 1.5 times. So you cannot rule out Russia, but the real victor has been America. USA has been the real victor of this Cold War. It destroyed Soviet Union. It destroyed the communist system, and the whole communist system collapsed. So there is a big ideological gap in the world affairs. But again, US is in grip of economic crisis. That is, that they are finding it very difficult to sustain their economy, and they are dependent on foreign powers for dole. And the Walmart and the introduction of the FDI is part of that economic activities by which they wish to revive their own economies. That is said and done. India has emerged during this period, and India is emerging. Now India is emerging as an economic power. It has opened it has done away with the license permit Raj, but it has not the administrative apparatus of India is not in tune with the opening of the system, as it was done during Mr. Narasimha Rao ji, when the present Prime Minister was Finance Minister. And the credit, of course, goes to Narasimha Rao because of it was his political authority which enabled Dr. Manmohan Singh ji to open up our economy. And now the license permit Raj is largely done away with, but the administrative apparatus is not in tune with that opening of the system. So we have a lot of difficulties in the development process.
We are emerging, but we need stronger political leadership. Nirmala ji, you represent the young generation of Indian leaders. Is this issue of world order, foreign policy, global affairs, are these integral to the new leaders of India? And how do they view these issues?
They're very integral to the new India, but I see a lot of parallel. In other words, I see that history in a way is getting repeated. I wouldn't probably stop at the Second World War and post-Second World War, looking back. I would go even further back. In the late 14th and 15th century, early 15th century, you saw in Europe establishment of companies with funds being given by the royal patronage, essentially to search for what they would call Indies, It was a search for economic raw material, search for resources which can fuel the transition which was happening in the essentially West European and somewhat in the East European context. Also a shift from the imperialistic mold towards what may be called a political churning, but essentially looking at economic well-being, which did not have adequate raw material support, and therefore they wanted to fuel it through search for countries which can fund them, essentially through companies which were funded. And today I'm referring to that as my starting point for looking back at history, because I find what is happening today, again to fuel the development of economies in the West, there is a search for markets which can give them raw or semi-raw or half-finished goods, and therefore it is probably a repetition similar to or comparable to the 15th century. But post Second World War, again India, whether it was a debate or discourse on looking at the way in which you want to set your house, you want to have a new affair or new engagement, even then India was trying to have its own dialogue. It didn't look at the left or the right, it didn't look at the bipolar world in that kind of, am I in this camp or am I in that? There was an engagement, there was an attempt to engage with the world, saying we would like to be ourselves and then we do not want to openly align. And after the Second World War, if you notice, even when the dialogue was on establishing a political identity for countries which were coming out of the imperialistic mold, India led the way. Whether you can credit it purely for Gandhi or the non-violence that we were adopting as a method, India set the way. Now, post-independence, most of the countries which came out of imperialistic fold were also attempting to see what is the kind of political, economic mixture that they can have. And in that too, I think India was trying to engage in giving a formulation which will be suitable for our needs. Whether that was right, whether I agree with it or you disagree with me, fact remains that we've always tried to engage in these kind of a way. And today we are recalling those days. Today we've come to a situation where post 60 years of our freedom, we are still sort of facing the same kind of a situation where much before we have asserted our nationalistic aspirations completely in a democratic framework, we are made to sit up to say, is this what we want? Is this opening up going to completely wash out my democratic but yet Indian aspirations? And therefore, today I think what is important for all of us to realize is let us not engage. I'm not saying anybody is doing it, but I'm only bringing in a note of caution. Let us not engage in a peripheral discourse on globalization, should we or should we not open up and so on. That debate comes, but comes, I understand, in the context of have we asserted our line of thinking, whichever be the consensus line of thinking which this country is going to come up with, especially because the youngsters today are very clear on what they are looking for. They want fair treatment, they want humanism, they want equal opportunity, they do not want to be denied any kind of developmental aspirations and goals and targets, but not compromising on certain value systems which are maybe universal, but typical of the Indian aspirations. And therefore, I think we are at a time in history which is very, very fortunate for all of us to remember that we are playing, knowingly or unknowingly, a very, very critical role in determining India's future in this changing world.
I think search for sources and search for welfare, search for greater presence in international affairs. And India, of course, as Nirmala ji just said, has played a very, very crucial role by giving alternative strategies of how to organize that competition and maybe organize it in more cooperative terms of interdependence. Talking of resources, the region that Professor Ramakrishnan works is also known for curse of resources. In West Asia, resources have been the cause of contention and cause of infliction of so much of violence on that region. How does that impinge on a region that has so many resources? How does that region participate and sort of influence the discourse on what kind of new global order should be about?
Before coming to West Asia proper and our relationship with the West Asian region, the kind of changes that are going on in world affairs in general is very significant. Very significant aspects of which are already mentioned. The initial impulse for a unipolar world is slowly going away, if not totally gone. Whether we are living in a multipolar world or not is a question that we have to address. The most important question when we discuss India's external engagement at this juncture is whether India is participating in the changed circumstances across the world, or are we contributing towards, the evolution of a new system. This is very important. A kind of passive onlooker role is not what we want as a large nation. What we want is an active role in shaping the world, because this is a time, the post-Cold War situation is a time where a global order can be created. It can be molded by important parties because it's not one or two actors determining its future. And therefore, our role here is to shape it to the extent that not only that our interests are served, but also that we provide the world with certain values and resources which would enable the world to look at questions or issues of the world with a perspective which is based on justice, which is based on democratic values on which we have an advantage as the largest democratic nation in the world and so on. Whether we were able to do that and are able to do that at this moment is the important question. Coming to India's linkage with the West Asian region, obviously our dependence on oil is a continuing thing, and the dependence is not going to reduce in the foreseeable future, because the quest for more economic changes within the nation is fueling this need for more oil, and therefore the West Asian region continues to be a significant region as far as India is concerned. And all the political changes which we may discuss later within the region is therefore very significant for us. Our own foreign policy matters should be determined not simply by policy measures of immediate concern, but also by what constitute the important parts of the whole world. So there should be a global vision and there should be regional visions as part of that vision. They cannot be separated in that sense. And I would also add that in today's world, not only with technology and globalization and other things, but also with the very skepticism towards all kind of Westphalian sovereign nation-state system, what is important is to see the linkages between the domestic and the international. And one cannot separate what's happening within our country with what we have to do with the rest of the world. And therefore, what we have to contribute to the rest of the world has a lot to do with what we do with our own people. And that is precisely where we can have certain values, we can have certain approaches which the people of India have contributed.
That's a very interesting point. New picture is one of continuum rather than any clear divisions, whether it is domestic or foreign, whether it is east or west, economics or politics. There is more picture of growing interdependence, more picture of fusion, and in that fusion, maybe that India has traditional advantages in understanding that fusion that is emerging at the international level. And does that fusion something that makes India have certain privilege in participating in international discourses? Do we have an advantage of being a mosaic society? And therefore, we are able to understand and are comfortable with uncertainties and fusions that we see around the world.
You see, we are a pluralistic society, and we are, from a religious point of view, we are a multi-religious society. So the democratic system which we have evolved, which is the outcome of our struggle for national independence, is most suited for our polity, for our society, and for the welfare of the society. Now, a fusion is emerging. Fusion means that there is no, the main target is the welfare of the people. The people are asserting themselves, that the people, and particularly as Nirmala ji has said, that the young people, now they have more information. When I was a student, there was no television. Even the radio was not very popular at that time among the students. But now, every student, even the small child, is more knowledgeable than most of us who were at that time in the universities. So, people have knowledge, people have information, people know about, are conscious about their rights. And in the global context, we say that we are participant. We are participants at the equal level. So there is a demand for change in the international order, and that is reflected in the demand for the restructuring of the United Nations. Now, with the end of the Cold War, a new world order is emerging, and in this, we have a greater say. We can have greater say, provided the leadership is clear and is strong.
There are aspirations for change, there is access to information, there is desire to participate in the new emerging world order. We will have a short break, but we come back soon and discover how India is located now with all major powers having friendly relations, and how can we participate in restructuring of security architecture and politics, and do we wish to see some changes in various structures and organizations which should have India participating and contributing to the emergence of new world order. We'll come back soon. Among several issues that are under discussion in terms of what structures should be organized to ensure an enduring peace around the world, there has been so much talk about reformation of United Nations, more specifically about United Nations Security Council. India is seen clearly as an important candidate, a rather deserving candidate to be accommodated in UN Security Council. There have been discussions, some reports are out, various formulations have been suggested. Likewise, several other regional organizations also have evolved global consciousness, and we see many regional organizations now inviting observers or dialogue partners from outside their own region, which reflects a kind of a transformation in these structures, which are originally structures of post-Second World War era, but are trying to catch up with new realities of 21st century. I'll start with Nirmala ji. What is India's view of how United Nations should be organized, reorganized, and how can India play a larger role in United Nations, which is the organization which is most potent as far as organizations that we know of that exist as of today.
It might be a bit contentious, but I would still say it. UN can be a lot more proactive, especially now that we are not talking about, in fact, we are not certainly talking about a unipolar world too. You had two poles, the days are gone. You were talking about unipolar, I would think post the subprime crisis, we are not even talking about that. And if that's the case, and you've already started in this discussion talking about sub-regional groups and regional groups, and therefore with this kind of a fragmentation which is very clear, and when you were talking about bipolar world, or in the context of cooling down of the bipolarity and the Cold War, you had European Economic Union and every other region also forming up unions. But not only the meltdown which has resulted in not having even a single pole, but a fragmentation of power, together with the Euro crisis, and together with the fact that the European Economic Community itself is wondering what is the ultimate unifying thing. The currency euro itself is now coming to question as to how long it is going to stay where it is, or is it going to have to be redefined. The subgroups will not have any exemplar to look up to. There was a time when people thought, okay, European Community's experience may be useful for us to look at how SAARC can be refashioned. Look at how Southeast Asian, ASEAN can be refashioned. I am not saying they were going to copy, but matter of fact, there is a consumerist greed which has set in, which has affected the developed so-called, not the south, but the northern economies. As a result, what has happened is you do not have these regional formations being sure of what kind of formulation, definition, setting of paradigms is possible. Now everybody is stopping and gazing to see where the world is going next. And therefore, I would think in this kind of given a fragmented political and economic power situation, where Africa, I am glad, is asserting itself, where India or China or Australia is asserting in terms of climate change issues, which you will probably refer to later on, but assertion from the point of view of your economic priorities, assertion from the point of view of asking questions which are pertinent for your nationality. The island nations are saying, where are we going to be? Now, these are pertinent issues when you are talking of regional formulations. I come back to the point, therefore, that I would expect the UN to be the multipolar, if you may want to call it that way, center of all these fragmented aspirations, fragmented sovereignties, fragmented economic centers. Each one has its own economic power arsenal, which will have to be in a fair and humanistic way articulated, and UN should become the forum for it. Unfortunately, probably because of want of resources, or probably they are also going through a transition, we are yet to see that role of the UN, and I wish they crack it soon, because the world is definitely waiting and watching. We can't lose more time on it.
That's a very interesting point. The early 1990s, one of the two pillars, the controlled economy, had collapsed, and then of course more recently 2008 onwards, the free market consumerist greed led to the other pole, as you said, becoming shakier. That is what particularly makes rising economies so visible, having greater leverages. And several of these are now using the same forum called United Nations to change the discourse in many ways. And some of these countries seem to look at similar old issues in a very different fashion. How has the inclusion or acceptance of these rising powers in a forum like G20, for example, has influenced the functioning of United Nations? Is the United Nations now able to come to different conclusions that it used to be during, let us say, the height of Cold War years? Ramakrishnan.
The important question is the restructuring of the UN has to take into consideration change global realities and how far it reflects that change reality. it does not reflect changed reality as of now, as the organization stands now. India is a contender for significant role in the UN. There are many other contenders. Different continents are not represented. And the challenge is to make the UN a representative body of global affairs as it stands now, which means that the UN has to imbibe certain values of democracy, which it really lacks.
That's a very interesting point. UN has to imbibe certain values of democracy. So choices. Yes, of course.
I thought I was saying something contentious. I would think this is even more contentious.
Yes, indeed. So choices are then, should we try to seek piecemeal reformation, or we think of redoing the whole thing again afresh? Do we have the second choice? How can India participate in these choices that are being sort of considered? In fact, let me ask Kishore Singh ji a very pointed question. What strategy could India adopt in either getting into helm of affairs, which is UN Security Council seat with a permanent seat and a veto, or should we think of alternative strategies in somehow reaching the big table so that we participate in decision making of international organization?
You see, it is a very unequal organization. Africa is not a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Latin America is not member. No country from Latin America is a permanent member of the Security Council. So, the structuring of the United Nations is most important. There should be representation from Africa, Latin America, and India has to play a very crucial role. Is playing the organization of the BRIC countries, Brazil and South Africa. We are trying to do it, but we are being prevented. And the one power which is most reluctant, or actually hostile also, the China is playing a very dubious role in regard to the India emerging as a permanent member of the Security Council.
And the question is, we are having this sentiment among panelists here that there is need to democratize international system, all structures, and develop new world order which is far more democratic. But we also seem to have an underlying sense here that it is actually the distribution of power, the real hard power that really reflects what happens in these structures, even if they are institutionally meant to be democratic. Is there some hope? All rising powers are today one to say, even China, we need to democratize international relations. What is a feasible strategy that we can adopt?
I look at it this way. To get to the high table is one thing. You can aspire for it, you can work for it, you will reach there sometime. That is very well. Second is also the representation of all the continents in some way or the other at the decision-making table. Yes, that is important. But I suppose what is even more important, and that can be palpably felt in presence or in absence, is when nations start providing that kind of a leadership, where, let us look back. I'm not speaking as a member of the BJP, but I'm speaking more as an Indian national. Whether you were in the UN Security Council or not, Indian foreign affairs and Indian political leadership was able to influence a certain kind of dialogue in the world, whether you're talking in terms of non-aligned. Today I may agree with it, I may not agree with it, is a different story. You tried playing an international role.
So are we talking about moral versus material power?
And also the point to have the courage of conviction, a certain strength of idea with which you start mobilizing nations to speak for a certain cause. It could be the cause of black people in South Africa when you were against apartheid. It could be the rights of people who were really suffering because they were being exploited as regards of denial of their own resources. It could be nations wanting to have their own alignment policy, or it could be the rights of the seafaring nations. We did so many other initiatives which mobilized a lot of strength in spite of at that time the communication networks were not being so widespread as it is today. So what I'm trying to drive at is, yes, we have to aspire to be at the high table, institutionally have representation for all the countries, but more importantly, even without all that, there was a time when Indian political leadership could take up an international call on issues, stand up and speak for it, and be heard. And once you're heard, you have more nations rallying around for it. And when you rally nations around, you're not there as a leader, you're there as a group speaking for a cause. And that kind of a thing doesn't require a permanent seat in the UNSC. You can do it even otherwise. So I think what is important, especially given the criticality of the historic moment in which we are, and to ensure that we don't lose out in this game, as was said earlier, you have to be a participant, an active participant in the process. And for that, it is important to have political leadership, effective political leadership, and a national consensus that we have to play a role in all this. There cannot be fragmentation when you're dealing with issues affecting the entire country, especially when you're dealing with international forums, speaking for countries which have similar aspirations.
Political leadership, Professor Ramakrishnan, it's an interesting point that we often make, that India has shifted from idealism to pragmatism. Has it also somewhere meant shift from traditional moral authority of great leaders to focus more on material power, alignment with great powers, a certain pressure to emerge as a great power, making us change our fundamental values in foreign policy? Do you see that change impinges on the moral authority of India?
The most important shift that, as you mentioned, as materialistic orientation, for me it's much more, these are neoliberal times where the market has a very significant role. And business interests, market forces, those kinds of forces get greater priority when we determine what should be our role in world affairs. I'm not saying that economic affairs should not be a primary concern of foreign policy making, but somewhere politics is lost sight of. Because when we are talking about India's role in world affairs, our engagement with the rest of the world, the primacy of politics is very significant. And what the neoliberal times have done is somehow to take that political meat, that crux out of our economic concerns. Somewhere they have to be joined together. And the kind of crisis that was mentioned earlier, the fragmentation in economic terms, have a lot to do with not asserting political leadership globally and not regulating markets properly. And therefore, what is important for countries like ours is not to go towards that kind of crass capitalism, which is ruining countries and people's lives in such a big manner, where we have to assert our politics with certain value orientation that you are referring to.
I think we are making a very interesting
Yes.
point here, that we are shifting somehow from commanding to demanding authority, moral authority. And I think that is where this whole idea of democracy becomes important, not in terms of building institutions and seeking participation just in terms of legal rights, but also in terms of gaining moral authority and participating in discourse in terms of value additions that a nation can make. We'll come back with a short break. We will discuss now how the whole discourse of how we can build world order is shifting fundamentally from state to people. Welcome back to India Interacts. We are discussing today India and the new emerging world order, responsibilities and challenges. Before we went to a short break, we were discussing issues like moral authority of leadership, we were discussing need for democratization, we were talking about shift from statist discourse to people's power. And we have also amongst us audience participants today who will be participating in this segment of the discussion. But before I open it for discussions from the audience, I'm going to quickly ask my participants here to pinpoint 3 or 4 issues that they see as fundamental issues for evolution of New World Order in which India seeks to participate. I will start with you, sir.
The first thing I would say that is the symbolic thing, that United Nations Security Council should be reorganized, it should be more representative, and then economic system should be discussed, it should find priority, and in that economic system, there are various aspects which others will cover. Climate change is there, the resources there, natural resources, how the natural resources should be managed worldwide so that no country is at a disadvantage. And then the question of military power, nuclear warfare, nuclear energy, and this energy security is another problem. These are the, but for India, apart from these things, Indian leadership has to show that we are a democratic society free of corruption. Because after all, in the world, when we want to have a say in the world affairs, and that on the basis of morality and our tradition, then we should have a less corrupt society.
Nirmala ji, India is rising power as we mentioned, and we have not only greater leverage but greater stakes in how the new world order emerges. What would you cite as 3 or 4 issues that India should seriously engage in ensuring that they are evolved the way India wants them to evolve?
Well, Rajji, I think our former minister has very clearly said it. I would put it this way, that the 4, I would think, very critical issues on which India should show the way is, one, national aspirations cannot be compromised on. Even I do not want to use the expression neo-liberal. I will certainly use the expression that opened up globally, free for all kind of a world where the spirit of entrepreneurship cannot be subjugated. But even then, what is important is the national aspirations will have to be accommodated. It cannot be we say you do kind of a relationship with anybody. That's one thing. And second, rightly, the share and optimum use of resources, particularly the natural resources, cannot be I can afford to buy, I will buy, I will spend. Those who can't afford it, I'm sorry, that cannot happen. There have to be a greater sense of parity, greater sense of, right and wrong on that. So the moral argument, I would think, is more perched on that. And that is where I think the Indian philosophy, the way in which Indian, particularly the Gandhian, and I very strongly look at Deen Dayal Upadhyaya's integral humanism, where very clearly you use for yourself, and so you would look at the world, and therefore the system starts from your little village to the entire globe, where everyone should have access and everyone should optimally use his resources. There should definitely be an international recognition for this kind of a thought, whether you call it this or that. The spirit is this, that natural resources cannot be only for the rich and the poor has to wait for their turn. Sorry, there has to be greater sense of parity. That has to be something which India has to literally peddle around the world to say this is what we want as one of the very important aspects of the new order. Third, nobody wants a war, but again, we have to be making sure that national interests are protected. You cannot have war of different kinds, infiltrations or a nuclear attack or anything happening, but the world order should be such that it ensures no war, peace-based arguments. And finally, on climate change. Again, the same argument which we're using for optimum resources very much applies for climate change too. You cannot be punished for your aspirations because you've started late in the world. But at the same time, you cannot also be allowing indiscreet exploitation, over exploitation of resources. I think we are coming to a world order where everyone is going to say what they want, and it should be a common.